This is Antony Lowenstein, a Sydney-based freelance journalist, author and, of course, blogger. He's written for the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, the Age, the Courier Mail, the Guardian, the Washington Post, and many others. And his second book, The Blogging Revolution, which we have here, of course, if you'd like to buy a copy, details his travels and experiences with bloggers in repressive and heavily censored countries, namely Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, China, and Cuba. So, I might start things off, if I may. Just the first question. So, from what you've seen in your travels, does the blogger or the online dissident have much more of an ability to be critical under a repressive regime as opposed to those working for traditional mainstream media? How much more freedom do you think they have?
I think probably overall it would be fair to say, I'm going to try and talk around to people and sort of go back and forth, so just forgive me, hopefully you can hear me. I think one thing that I was trying to look at when I was doing this book was to sort of say that a lot of people who are bloggers aren't necessarily doing it for political reasons. So in China, say, there are 250 million people online. It's the biggest online community in the world. There are 230 million in America, so it is the biggest online community in the world. But most people who are blogging are not doing it for politics. They're looking at downloading films, or they're trying to meet guys and girls or whatever. So it's not just about politics. But the government, of course, is fearful of people who organise and who do write about politics. And one of the things, I guess, that interested me in a place like China was the perception we had. This came out in the last 6 months with the Olympic Games, that it's very easy just to simply say that China's a repressive regime, full stop. It is repressive and it's authoritarian, it does hideous things on human rights that everyone here would know, but it's far more complex than that. And one of the things that a lot of bloggers are talking about, online communities themselves are talking about in China, is the fact that many people, there's a great more debate going on within China about these issues than we would like to believe. So about whether it's not so much challenging one party state, you can't really do that openly. People do and they get thrown in jail. But maybe talking about corruption, or after the recent Sichuan earthquake in May, there was a great deal of discussion online, including on the streets, about corrupt officials who had built dodgy houses. And the fact that you had protests against that kind of thing is quite unique. You wouldn't have that sort of thing 5 or 10 years ago before the web. So although there is a lot of repression and problems, the fact that there are slowly but surely greater freedoms that are coming up in a place like China, despite the fact that there are massive problems that still need to be overcome.
Okay. Now, just about blogs in general, how do you go about reconciling the lack of any, what I guess you'd call apparent credibility when you're comparing blogs to more mainstream and more traditional media sources? How do you, as a blogger, not simply come off as someone who's having a bit of a rant? And how do we, as readers of bloggers, know or decide what we think we should be paying attention to and what we should subscribe to?
I think the idea about how most people see the mainstream press and blogging is changing. So I get asked this question a lot. People sort of say, well, I read the Sydney Morning Herald say, and I guess I might trust that more than I would if I just read some guy who's blogging randomly. But I think those sort of figures are changing, because many studies in the West say that the majority of people, although they may still engage with some kind of media, whether it's the mainstream press or radio or TV, they actually don't particularly trust that much what they read, or they're very sceptical about it. That doesn't mean therefore they trust the blogger because he or she is blogging and ranting about something. But I think the sense that bloggers are just simply people who are ranting is not entirely true anymore. You have got people who are just going to rant about politics, or about their cat, or about their girlfriend, or whatever. But I think what's happening and changing in the last years is that many bloggers are seeing themselves in a small way as providing an alternative to the mainstream media. So although an average blogger can't compete with The Age or The Australian or The New York Times, I think what it can do is be more critical and more sceptical, and actually suggest that I don't see this question anymore as the mainstream media versus online. It's very much they must work together. The simple fact is that the resources of the mainstream press is far greater than bloggers could ever have. So although just in the last week we've seen with Fairfax the 450, 500 staff they're going to get rid of, although Fairfax is a dying organisation, there's no doubt about that, and the management of Fairfax has made a decision in the last years that they're going to focus their funds more on dating sites and lifestyle rather than investigative journalism. If those papers die, with however bad they are now, things would be far worse if they didn't exist. And the kind of resources that the journalists of those papers have is still far greater than bloggers could ever have at the moment. So really what the whole debate keeps on coming back to whenever you have these discussions is, how do you find a sustainable business model for online? And there's no answer to that question in a simple sense, but something like, say, Crikey is an interesting example. It's an online media source, it's doing fairly well. It does good stuff and bad stuff. I mean, I write for it, so I'm a bit biased, but I think it's an interesting example of some media which is an online source and employs journalists who don't just sit on their arse in an office. They go out and do some investigative work, or they provide views you don't hear anywhere else. And I guess I'm encouraged by the fact that in many non-Western countries, there's not even this debate is sort of seen as really indulgent. The fact is that in most countries I went to, the state media is propaganda. It's as simple as that. So if someone wants to actually engage and find out what's going on or get a different perspective, they have to go online, and therefore they go to blogs. Whether it's in Egypt, where I looked at people who torture in prisons is a big issue in Egypt. And everyone knows that the regime has been using torture for decades, but it's never been really discussed, apart from just with friends and some hushed tones. And in the last few years, there's been examples of policemen in prisons who are filming themselves raping prisoners. Generally men raping men rather than men raping women. And they're filming these horrific acts, and then they've been circulating them online to try and make other people scared. The result, though, actually has been the opposite, where people actually have put this stuff on YouTube and started a campaign against police torture. Now, police torture still goes on and hasn't stopped, but what has changed is now it's become a public issue, which it wasn't before. And also it's put pressure on the regime, which is backed by the US. It's the second highest recipient of US aid after Israel in the world, that actually puts these issues in a way on an agenda with only a handful of activists. And that to me is a healthy thing. Now, it would be healthier if torture stopped altogether, of course, and that may happen if it's not a dictatorship anymore, which it is. But I think it's encouraging that the web and that place has empowered people to actually talk about honestly the fact that their own state, paid for by us, the West, is torturing its own citizens and filming it, and sort of sharing that information to show off the fact that they are torturing and raping people, which is a twisted way to get your rocks off.